This is a gracious thing in God's sight, in God's eyes. And I remember saying that in the original Greek, it actually says, this is grace. This is grace. In other words, you are evidencing grace when you submit even to an unrighteous, unjust, unreasonable employer or master. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Likewise. In other words, the same basic principles apply. And therefore, when you are being subject to your husband, you are demonstrating grace in your life. That's what he's saying. So that's the first thing. Secondly, a command to submit to your husbands, a command to be obeyed. Now, is this a keepable, an observable command? Well, of course it is. If the one that's delivered to servants can be obeyed, then the one that's delivered to wives can also be obeyed. We have to see it in the context there. All of these commands are capable of being obeyed. Human nature being what it is, husbands being what they can be, and wives being what they can be too, the prerequisite is grace. None of this is possible apart from grace. But given grace, then of course, all things are possible. And so what he's doing is, if you like, he's importing some of the stuff from the earlier part of his argument about servants and masters, and he's bringing that to bear upon the wife-husband relationship without actually saying so explicitly. But there is grace. We can obey by grace. Without grace, we can't. We cannot be the people we ought to be in our relationship with each other apart from grace. And of course, when we refer to grace in this context of wifely submission, what we are doing is paying regard firstly to the demands of the situation in which submission has to take place. Marriage is a beautiful thing. It's also often a difficult thing. And there are stresses and strains, and people's patience is tried. And there's so much scope for misunderstanding and misrepresentation and nastiness, and all kinds of things can happen, as well as the beautiful things, of course. And so Peter is well aware of the need for grace in that general situation of marriage. But grace also refers to the nature of the one to whom the wife is being asked to submit. Wives, be subject to your husbands. But what are husbands? Well, they are sinners being saved by grace, or maybe they're not even saved. Maybe they're not even saved, which is actually the scenario here, the unequal marriage. And husbands are sinners, and some of us can be pretty difficult to live with. This is a hands-on heart session. Okay? We've got to be true and realistic about it, because if we are not, we will not appreciate what Peter is saying to us in the passage, and saying to wives in particular. And of course, thirdly, grace applies also to the nature of the one who is being asked to submit, because wives are sinners too. And they get it wrong, and they try the patience of their husband, and so on. And so what you find here is that Scripture, as everywhere, is very realistic about the human condition and about the circumstance which the human condition creates. And all along it tells us, yes, this is a doable commandment, but only on the basis of divine grace. And that is how the command comes across to us. It's a command because if it were left to us as a kind of option, well, I think that there'd be more of a mess than there is. But it's a command because we are sinners. But it's a command that we can obey through our relationship with God. And so Peter's saying, I guess, wives, you need to be with God in order to be with your husband. It's that kind of order of relationship. And if you look, he's not calling us to blind obedience, or calling you to blind obedience. He actually provides a biblical rationale. He gives reasons. And there are three here that I want to refer to very briefly. He says that you should submit to your husbands, firstly, at the beginning of verse 5, because this is the way of a holy woman. This is what distinguishes you as separate from the world. This is what marks you out as belonging to the Lord, that you actually submit to your husband and call him Lord. And then in the second part of verse 5, he says it's also the way of the hopeful woman, the woman who has set her hope on God. This is a distinguishing characteristic. And the third thing he does in chapter 6 is to say, well, submission is not something to be afraid of. Don't be frightened by it. He says something similar to servants, doesn't he? You know, don't be afraid of submitting to your boss, even if he's unreasonable. Don't be afraid of that. You've got nothing to be afraid of in this. So that's the command. It's a doable command on the basis of grace, and obeying it marks you out as a holy woman, as one who has set her hope on God, and it's not something to be afraid of. Thirdly, a manner of life. There's a way of doing it. It's a manner of life. And there I'm referring to 3 through 6. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the wearing of gold, the putting on of clothing. Let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. And then he says, for this is how holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, and so forth. Recognize the creation order. This is how God ordained it from the beginning. This is the order of things. Even in the church we observe that. I know that today people find that hard. I think I referred last week to somebody who came into church and walked out at the end totally unimpressed because we didn't have women in leadership here, and so forth. But this is the way that the holy women of old used to behave. Recognizing the creation order, being respectful of that in their marriage. Those women whose eyes are on the Lord, which is absolutely essential for this to work, are holy and they hope in God. We've said that already. And so their first aim is to please God. Nothing different here from the necessity of children obeying their parents. That is their duty to God. So doing your duty to your husband is doing your duty to God. But then in doing their duty to God, they please their own husband. They don't please anyone else. They don't have a duty to anyone else. Nor ought they to try and impress anyone else. Only their own husband through their obedience. They please him in whatever way is appropriate. And what he says here is a negative thing and then a positive thing. Firstly, he says, negatively, do not let your adorning be external. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't try and imitate Jezebel. I remember one pastor some years ago talking to a young people's group, and it's never gone out of my mind, and maybe it should have, but he said to the young ladies there, he said, look, if you ain't got it, it's no good trying to paint it on. And if you have got it, why do you need to paint? So, there you go. The emphasis is clear. The emphasis is clear. Not the outward adorning. Positively, let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart. Not the outward, but the inward. Concentrate on the inward. That's where the true beauty is. That is the imperishable beauty. It doesn't go away. Some of us have learned not to look in the mirror too frequently these days. It's not good for us. But what's on the inside doesn't perish. And of course, husbands need eyes to look behind, to see what's on the inside. Because that is always impressive, that's always valuable when it bears the marks of Christ. So concentrate on the inside, not on the outside, and strive for that Christ-like disposition inside your own personality. And as that works out, you'll find that even your own personality, those bits of it that are awkward and difficult and so on, will eventually be tamed and brought into captivity to Christ. And that is what God values, he says in verse 4. That is what God values. And if a husband is worth his salt, that's what he values too. True Christ-likeness. The inward disposition, the adorning of the hidden person of the heart. That is a beauty that doesn't fade away. And finally, a goal to aim at. And I suppose what he's talking about here in this bit is a good testimony, the testimony of Christian submission on the part of a wife. I suppose it's to do with a question of identity. Submission, in that sense, is a defining characteristic. It's a badge of the holy woman, somebody who is separate from the world, who thinks Christianly about her husband, about herself, about her family, about the church, about the world in which she lives. It's also the badge of a trusting woman, a woman who depends upon God in the stresses and strains as well as the blessings of the marital relationship. And it's a badge of the grace of God at work in her life. She's born again and she's being sanctified by the Holy Spirit. And I think that those are good things for all of us to reflect on in this context, for wives to reflect on in their marriage. But it's not just saying who we are, saying who you are to your husband and to those who look on. It also expresses a desire to reach the lost, even within your own marriage. Now, the fact of the matter is that in New Testament times, a lot of the marriages were mixed marriages, in the sense that one partner had been converted and the other not. Whoever happened to hear the gospel first. That happens today. I don't think we should seek that kind of relationship as Christians. But in a missionary situation, it happens all the time. And so one partner is a believer and the other isn't. Wifely submission is a way of evangelizing the unbelieving husband. That's what he's saying here. It's a means of commending Christ by the Christ-like disposition. And you don't have to say a whole lot. What does he say here? Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. So from one point of view, it's easy, isn't it? You don't have to say anything. You just have to submit in a Christ-like way. And of course,